still have people joining in here regularly, but wow, wasn't expecting 100 people on this webinar, but nice to see everyone's interested in this topic and wants to know more. So that said, plan on getting started here. On the line, we have Justin Challenger from the State Conservation Commission. We also have Eric Cromer. He works for the commission. Brian Smollett from Labor and Industries on the line. We'll have a little presentation from Kent Bidding from Lancaster County, him and also Jared Shippey from NRCS. They have, Kent has a little presentation about how Prevailing Wage is working for them in Lancaster and how they're combining it with EQIP funds. And also Jared's on to answer any EQIP related questions. So thank you to everybody for joining in. I appreciate it. And everybody that's going to help out and present. What we plan to talk about today, I plan to clarify some frequently asked questions. Those of you who are in the Dirt and Gravel Road program, this presentation will look awful familiar. Thank you to Sherry Law and Roy Richardson for putting this presentation together for their program, which made it very easy for us. We could pretty much just copy it, replace a couple words here and there and a little bit different things and make it work very well. So thank you, Sherry, in particular, for doing that. Plan on going over prevailing wage requirements, again, discussing EQIP and ACAP, and then at the end, we'll have an open question and answer session. I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there, and luckily we have Brian on the line to help answer any of the ones that we can't answer. Thank you again, and let's get started. So what is prevailing wage, right? That's everybody's question. It's an actual state legislation, the Prevailing Wage Act, and it basically says prevailing wage rates are to be paid to contracted labor for construction projects with an estimated cost of $25,000 or more when public funds are involved. Pretty straightforward there. Like the next question is, who determines prevailing wage rates? There's only one entity that can determine prevailing wage, and that's Labor and Industry, the Bureau of Labor Law Compliance. And I believe, Brian, that you're the director of Labor Law Compliance, is that right?
That is correct. I'm the director of the Bureau of Labor Law Compliance. And if you don't, so the technicality would, of course, be that under the Act, the quote, Secretary of Labor and Industry determines. Labor Law Compliance is the arm of that determination, or the office that makes those determinations. That is correct.
Awesome, thanks. When does the Prevailing Wage Act apply to ACAP projects? As we were just talking about, when the estimated or total cost of a project, that's key there, estimated or total cost, funded in part or in whole by ACAP funds is $25,000 or more, any contracted labor must be paid prevailing wage. There are some things I believe that don't count towards that threshold, and I don't have those specifically, so we wanted to have Brian have a chance to explain what those might be. Brian, can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So on the first part of this slide, what's very important, and let's remember something first off the bat. The prevailing wage law was penned and written literally in the 1960s with regulations that were promulgated soon thereafter. So we're talking about old legislation that doesn't always give us what we need in black and white. So we have to look to a number of different things to answer those gaps, to fill those gaps in. Case law, court opinions, previous practice. And sometimes even we look to the federal government for guidance on some weird things that pop up now and then. On the part about estimated cost, the fun part about the Prevailing Wage Act is it never says when the estimated cost needs to happen. So when does that happen? Well, we run into circumstances quite a bit where someone will estimate the cost to be $24,000, but then the job actually costs $30,000, and they come to us and say, hey, we never estimated prevailing wage. What do we do here? We tell them, unfortunately, now the project is covered and every bit of work that happened needs to be covered. On the flip side, someone estimates the cost to be $25,000, but when the bids come in and the work is done is less than $25,000. What happens there? Well, the reality is 25,000 was not met, so it's not covered, right? So there's no real rule as far as when it should be. However, we tell people estimate prior to when the bids go out, because then you have a good handle on what's the true estimated costs, what counts into that. This one's a little bit more clear. Labor and materials, when combined together, if it amounts to more than 25,000 in estimated cost, that meets the threshold. So what doesn't factor in there? Engineering costs from someone who works in an office. The manager's salary, perhaps, who's the foreman on the job, unless that foreman is doing actual work. If the foreman is not doing work, it may not factor in. Perhaps any of the cost of a grant manager, someone who you're paying a salary to. That's not estimated into this project. What you would look to, the materials that are going into this job and the labor that it's going to cost to put those materials in or to do whatever, when that's combined together, that's what you look to for your 25,000.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Just a quick follow-up. Say, like in ACAP program, the farmer may supply, like he's the one at the end that's getting the grant. So say the farmer supplies some stone or labor to the project. Do those, like, does that in-kind contribution count?
It could very well count. We would have to, and some of those specifics are always very technical, but I will say this, if you have a project and there's already a count of that material going into it, yes, it should count into it, because you're looking to the total estimated cost of any of the materials going in there, regardless of who puts it in, and then the labor itself. And we can get into some details about, you will get into details about when prevailing wage coverage happens, but in theory, I would say yes, in that example, that should count in for the cost.
Awesome. All right, thanks.
And then someone actually said engineering planning costs do not contribute. Correct. They don't contribute to the cost.
Okay. Did we cover that first question that came, what if prevailing wage labor would put the project at 30,000, but not using prevailing wage, the cost would be 24,500.
Okay, so when you're doing the estimated cost, it needs to be good faith. And what I will just say as the overall answer to that type of a question would be, if a cost is being sort of looked at to avoid prevailing wage purposely, that could be an issue, right? And sometimes these jobs, which are very close in proximity to that 25,000, we have to make sure if we get a complaint, we would have to make sure that it was a good faith estimate, which means that someone accounted for potential prevailing wage. Amanda, I would advise you and I can have a further discussion. Give me a phone call and we can talk more about that specific question.
Okay, thanks. So what is the grant recipient's responsibility for prevailing wage, right? So it is the grant recipient's responsibility to contact Bureau of Labor Law Compliance for a prevailing wage rate determination for the project. In most cases, I'm thinking the district is gonna assist the farmer with that. I don't know how comfortable they would be doing that. It's not hard to do. I'll show you how I'll show you here in a few slides how to do that. But I'm thinking the district is probably going to have to help navigate through that process in some fashion. I know there's a lot of districts out there now that do it with dirt and gravel roads. So if you have questions and on particulars on how to do certain things, we can get into the details of that stuff. And on a case by case, like reach out to us at the commission and we can help you walk through that process a little more in detail. And again, it's not overly difficult, but I'll show you how to do it here in a slide or two. If prevailing wage applies to the project, the grant recipient must ensure contracted labor is paid that prevailing wage. It's pretty obvious there. If bidding is required, the bid has to say prevailing wage is required and has to be included in that contract. One thing to keep in mind, that wage determination is only valid for 120 days from the date it was issued. So if you guys are well ahead of the plan and you're not signing a contract for that project within 120 days, you might have to redo those rates, which again isn't overly difficult, but just keep that in mind. Brian, all good there?
We are all good there. And the 120-day determination date, what I would advise folks to do out there would be this. If you know about a project a year in advance, don't ask for rates yet because that rate determination will expire. What you could do to get an idea of what perhaps the rates are is check our website and we have a public website where you can search any project that we give rates out on. And you can look to a certain county as a general idea as to what the rates might be. But it's probably best practice to request those rates when you're getting closer to the actual project award date to avoid potentially going over that 120 days.
Yep, that actually leads well into the next slide. Here's a link, and we can get everyone this link, but if you Google PA prevailing wage rate search, it comes up very quickly. It's pretty easy to find. But that'll get you to a page where you can actually initiate that determination online. It's very easy, very simple form to fill out. One thing to keep in mind, like solicitors and commission staff, or if there's any technical assistance help you get out there, we can give an interpretation of what we think the Prevailing Wage Act rules might be, but really at the end of the day, it's the Bureau of Labor Law Compliance that makes those determinations. So if you really, there are some questions we can answer pretty easily, but there's a lot of stuff that will come up that we'll have to kick to Brian and get him to answer and give us a formal answer on there. So again, just keep in mind, like, you'll hear, our attorney said we don't have to pay prevailing wage. That will come up occasionally, or, a contractor feels they don't have to do it, and really at the end of the day, it's up to the prevailing wage is up to the Bureau of Labor Law Compliance. So they're the ones who make the final determination.
And if I can make a real quick note on that, if you don't mind me just saying.
Sure. Yeah,
We're in an imperfect world, right? So when we make a determination, if you think that we are so wrong, they're completely out of their minds. How dare they say this is covered work? And that you want to challenge us in some way, you're in luck. There's actually a venue for that. So just to put it out there, we make our determination based off of what we feel the law would force us to have to say. If you feel that we're wrong in some form, any interested party who receives a determination from us could challenge that to the Pennsylvania Prevailing Wage Appeals Board. Now, I'm not trying to draw more business for them or try to say, question us all the time, but just so you know, there is a course of action if you think that we're really, really wrong about something. And if you think our determination was in error, you want us to reconsider something, or we don't have all of our facts, we work with people like that all the time. Most of the time, the determinations that we make are pretty straightforward and pretty black and white. I think as some of these newer grants come up and some newer types of work come up, we have to do some research too. And quite frankly, we rely on the person asking us for the determination sometimes to educate us about what that work is. Maybe something we never heard about before, right? So we would work with whoever needs a determination of this nature, just so you know that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Two questions came in. Is the rate locked in if the contract is signed within 120 days of the registration?
Yep, so that would be, let's say you asked for rates today, January 26th, you signed the contract on February the 1st. Whatever rates we give out today are good for the duration of that project. Even if the work doesn't start for another 3 months until the summertime, it goes by the contract award date. So when you have the rates in your hands, here's your paper, here's your rates, they are good for the life of the project. So as long as that took place within 120 days from the determination to the contract being signed.
Okay, next question. If a farmer provides labor towards a project, would they receive prevailing wage rates?
If the farmer has his or her own employees doing it, the answer is no. One of the key points about prevailing wage is that it must be under contract. And what we mean by that is that, let's say a farmer gets this grant and that farmer doesn't contract out, they can do something themselves. It wouldn't meet prevailing wage, because for prevailing wage to be implied, it needs to be 25,000 in cost, right? We covered that. It needs to be construction, reconstruction, demolition, alteration. And then finally, it needs to be contracted out. So the contract would be, hey, I'm a farmer, but I can't do the electrical work. I have to contract that part out. That's prevailing wage. But I'm a farmer. I could actually dig this trench myself. I'm doing it myself. That's not prevailing wage. It's when it's contracted.
Okay, thanks. We got a couple more flowing in here. If there's a change after the contract is awarded on a project under 25,000, that makes it go over 25, does prevailing wage kick in? And if so, is it retroactive?
Yes and yes. And that's why we ask for the good faith estimate up front, because if you are that close and borderline, this happens quite often. If this is going to cost 24,000, we're good. Material cost goes up or extra labor's needed. Yes, that means now when it's over 25, the reality is it met or exceeded 25,000, number one. And then number two, that means any of the work which was funded in part by taxpayer dollars, that's prevailing wage. So you would have to retro prevailing wage. They get kind of sloppy. That's why the good faith estimate up front is the best thing to do.
Okay. And it never fails to surprise me how many what if questions there are out there from prevailing wage. You think you heard them all, and then they just keep rolling in. But
We ask them
next
to in
one,
our office. It's okay.
right? So what does farmer doing the work himself mean? For example, like if he has a friend do the work and the farmer privately pays him for the work, would that count as contracted labor?
We're getting into an interesting question on what exactly a contract would be. I would say the answer on that is most likely yes, if that person is not a direct employee of the farmer. So there's a whole separate law that on contract law, things of that nature. But if it's the farmer's employee, no. If it's a friend who can do this work, yeah, I think so, honestly, because it's not someone who's working directly for the farmer as a taxed employee. So I would think that would be something where prevailing wage would kick in.
Okay, thanks. So the next question, the farmer portion of the construction would be included in the cost of the project. I think that's a question for me. Yeah, Donna, yes, we can pay that. That's all part of the expense. So, how do you handle a company that the contractor is the sole employee and the owner does not pay hourly rates?
Yeah, we'll be bureaucratic on this one because there is an answer to this that a lot of people scratch their heads at. So let me first say, we get it. It sounds strange, but I'll preface it that way. Under the Prevailing Wage Act, the act itself states that anyone who is a quote workman on the job, unquote, must receive prevailing wage. What does that mean? Clearly, employees who work for a contractor, that's easy. The sole proprietor, under the act, again, this is the bureaucracy, think that for a second, put the bureaucratic cap on. But under the act, that sole proprietor should be, number one, paying himself or herself the prevailing wage. And number two, under the act, we would say that they should be doing certified payrolls. I'm sure we'll get into that certified payroll thing in a few.
Yeah.
So they might not get an hourly rate, but when you're on a taxpayer funded job, when you're accepting tax dollars to do the work, prevailing wages are still applicable. Therefore, you must still actually put yourself on a payroll in some form, pay yourself. If you want to rip the check up, no one's going to file a claim against you because you're the one not being paid by yourself, right? But in theory, you have to document the fact that you have hours on that job and in technicality, pay yourself for the work you've done. Somehow, so you have to somehow factor in what the hourly rate was for the work you're doing, get that on a certified payroll, somehow prove that you've paid yourself this money. Because again, there needs to be accounting for where the grant dollars are going to, right? It's tax money going somewhere. There's got to be some form of an accounting of that money and where it ends up at.
All right, I think that covers that for now, but thanks for the questions. Keep them coming. Next slide. So can we split a project into different phases to avoid prevailing wage? So the answer would be if you complete work for an ACAP funded project in multiple phases over the life of one grant, right? So one contract, one grant, the work is still considered one project and prevailing wage applies to the total 25,000. What we've been told in the past, if you receive two different grants in different years, prevailing wage is separate. Is that still true, Brian? Are those slides good?
They're good, and it could be true in it. Well, listen, there's always a chance that maybe something's a little bit different from that rule. Let me maybe simplify it this way. Let's say you received a grant today because you need a new roof on whatever building, right? So the grant was for this roof. You did the roof, got the money, but then you're thinking, oh my goodness, we need an entire new electrical system. You apply for another grant next year. It's a whole separate bidding process, a whole separate grant. That's probably something where it's two separate projects. Where it gets questionable would be year number one. Let's say we have a massive location. We get a grant the first year for the roof. Next year for the same exact roof, we get a second grant. Probably still one project because you're getting money that's paying for that one project in different phases. So as a whole, I would argue your slide is true, but there could be some differences based off of the work that's being done and what's being put out for bid. Is that going to make sense? And hopefully that. So the easy answer is maybe that is most of the time true, but call us if you have questions on those specifics.
Yep, I was just gonna say that if you get into a weird what if situation, we should, you guys can get a hold of us at the commission, we can get a hold of Brian, or you can go directly to him and his staff, and they'll help you out with that. We had a follow-up question to the sole proprietor. Can a sole proprietor simply show that they took a draw from the company instead of cutting a payroll check?
That's probably fine, honestly. We're not going to go too hardcore on someone who does something like that, because here again, what's important would be that certified payroll to show an accounting of where money's kind of going to. And the true technical answer is on that certified payroll, there needs to be a section filled out as to how the payment was made. Honestly, on something like that, that would most likely work, and that's probably fine, yeah. But the certified payroll is important, and in theory, that specific worker, even if it's a sole proprietor, must pay himself. Again, the money's probably absorbed right back into the company, right? We get that. There's a certain logic to this, and there's not logic in one way also. So instead of getting too hung up on it, I would say yes, the answer to that was we can accept that.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question, if a project has 3 separate components and contractors, say fencing, well drilling, and excavation, do they have to submit one request rate, or do they do one for each separate contract?
They would do one. And the beauty of our rates, sometimes people don't like it, sometimes people do. When we give rates out, we give rates out on any possible work that would take place in that job. So when you get a set of wage rates, it might be 12 pages. You might only need a plumber, right? But you're going to get from us a complete set of anything that might happen on that job. So the answer to that question is one set of wage rates is perfectly fine because it's going to be all the different positions of work that would happen on a job.
Okay, if ACAP is used for a portion of a multi-phase project that has already started, and the total cost is over 25,000, but the segment of the project ACAP is used towards is under 25,000. Does prevailing, oh, I think I see what they're saying. So like if state funds only go to a small part of the overall project, and that's over 25, but the state funds only go to the part that's under 25, does it apply to the whole thing?
Most likely it applies to the whole thing with the caveat of this. There's something called a quote logical demarcation. What does that mean? There was a court case, and without going into too much detail, the court basically ruled, hey, Department of Labor, a portion of work right here was privately funded, a portion right here was publicly funded, and the type of work that was happening was so different from each other, you cannot consider that one project. So those possibilities are there. That's when you can call us to make a determination on your job, and we would make a determination if there is this logical demarcation from one to the other. But as a whole, if there is all of this work in, I use the building, for example, a roof's being done, carpets being laid, electricals being put in, and the basement's being redone with concrete, right? Whole building refurbishing. The grant's paying for possibly the electrical system. The electrical system goes to the entire building. Our department would argue the entire building is covered by prevailing wage because you're putting into this building taxpayer dollars, right? And the building will not function until that work is done in the entire building. Where it may not be the same example would be a garage is being built and there's a building being built. The garage is being paid for with the grant. The building is private. That could be an example of a logical demarcation from two separate buildings with one caveat, right? Prevailing wage is interesting like this. If you have contractors, one contractor doing the entire job, now that gets a little questionable. Let's say there was no separate bidding process. Now a little bit rougher because what would you do then? Would Brian, the worker, get prevailing wage for 25 minutes and I run across and do my garage work and I get prevailing wage for 30 minutes? Now I go here and I'm not prevailing wage. They get kind of sloppy. Best thing to do is on that question, call us up and we will make a determination to your project as far as coverage and whether there is a logical demarcation.
Okay. So the next question, I'm gonna skip over some of these questions. We'll hit them at the end. I don't want to get too bogged down in questions, but I think I can handle the next one. What's the typical time frame on getting a prevailing wage determination? And that, like, when you fill out the form and hit submit on the website, it comes up right away. So it's pretty easy and it's instant, right? Is that still that way, Brian?
Yeah, you'll get you'll get an email back immediately that we have it. And as long as you get it to us before 4 o'clock on a Friday, we're going to probably get it done that same exact morning or afternoon you submit it.
Yeah, it goes pretty quick. So, Jess, we're going to hit your question here at the end, and Jamie, we'll get to it at the end if you guys hang on. Let us go through these slides, and if you have questions, save them to the end for us so we don't get too terribly bogged down here. And we might cover your question in the presentation too, so just stay tuned. I think we talked about this a little bit just previously, but what if the farmer or landowner completes part of a project and a contractor completes the other part? So the portion of work completed by the farmer is not subject to prevailing wage, which we talked about earlier, because it's not contracted labor, but it does count towards the total cost of the project. Since the total cost is over 25,000, prevailing wage has to be paid on the contracted labor, regardless of how much of the project the contractor works on. But we've run into this in the past in dirt and gravel road program where there was like a guy came out with a crane to set a structure, and that was the only part that was contracted. So they had to pay that contracted labor, even though it was less than 25,000. So it's kind of similar there, but a little bit different in ACAP, different scenario. The ACAP grant is over 25,000, but two contractors each complete part of the project, and each part is less than 25,000. Do the contractors still get prevailing wage? Again, yes, it's off the total project. You can't split them in half or hire several different contractors to get under that 25,000 threshold. Very straightforward. Prevailing wage applies to construction project, but not maintenance. How do I know whether my project is construction or maintenance? This is a great question. The Prevailing Wage Act does call out maintenance, and there's definition for that. Repair of existing facilities when the size, type, or extent of facilities is not changed or increased. I know there's some guidance on that. Brian, do you guys have a spot we can send them to for more information? Or
well, depending on the job. So for sure, if it's like a highway type work or any roadway work, we have a listing of what is maintenance versus what is not maintenance. However, when it comes to building work or anything of that nature, we go on a case by case basis and you can ask us for a determination. I always give this example to try to get your mind wrapped around what maintenance might be. You're looking in your room right now, you see a little part of the carpeting that's torn up. You want to fix that little part of the carpeting. You fix that little part, you glue it down, that's maintenance. But let's say you hate the carpeting, we're going to replace it. It's the same exact type of carpeting. We're going to replace the entire thing with a brand new piece of carpeting, right? Whole new floor. That's not maintenance, right? Because maintenance would be if you're not changing the extent of that room you're in. So use that maybe mentally as the guide as to what maintenance is. It's limited in its exception. It does exist, however, so I would advise you to call us up or email us and we would make determinations on maintenance.
All right, thanks. And, you know, really, in ACAP, I'm not really thinking of much that would be considered maintenance. So there may be something out there I'm not thinking of right now, but, I think everything we've thought of so far falls under that, construction. How much more does prevailing wage cost than other rates? This really varies by where you're at and what you're doing. We can't give you like an exact, you know, it's gonna cost X amount of dollars. I've heard across the board from different counties that some say, you know, we're seeing a 10-20% increase, others are saying 50%. It's, again, it's hard to say exactly what it's gonna be on every project or give you an average at this point, but if you're looking for kind of an idea of what it's gonna cost, you can go on that website we talked about earlier, and you can look at projects that were done in your area recently, and you can get an idea of what those rates would be. And kind of give you an idea of what it would cost. Here's just a screenshot of that website. That link there at the top, prevailing wage rate determination request form. That's where you would go to actually request the rates for your project. The one at the bottom, the determination search, that's where you can go and find individual projects in your area that had prevailing wage and what those rates were. So if prevailing wage applies to my project, who gets it? Again, we've covered this a lot up to this point with questions, but farmers and landowners are not the contractors and don't need to be paid prevailing wage. Any contracted labor, including owner operators of the contracted business, must be paid prevailing wage. Supervisory personnel do not need to be paid in prevailing wage. And then again, if they're there to inspect, provide guidance on site, but if they actively participate in the construction, like picking up a shovel or running a backhoe or you know, any type of setting fence posts, then they should be paid prevailing wage for those hours they spend actually doing construction. You could run in an instance where there's a vendor whose sole involvement is delivering materials to the project, like truck drivers delivering stone. They don't get paid prevailing wage if they're just delivering the stone to the site, unloading it and leaving. If they come to the site and they're doing work on that project while they're there, like they drop off the stone and then they pick up a load of dirt and move it somewhere else on the site, or take a load of dirt off site, and they're doing work on that project. Now they have to be paid prevailing wage for that time working on the project. Cover that right, Brian? Anything to add?
Yeah, there might be, and I think you did, and one thing that happens a lot of times, if there's a dedicated pit, hauling location, dump or scrap yard to the job site, right? And that truck driver is going back and forth from the prevailing wage project to the dedicated site back and forth. That might be all covered work because that could be a truck driver rate, right? For all that work back and forth. What makes a big difference is if you're hauling scrap away to an actual junkyard that's open for the public, right? That's different. Now you're going to be hauling stuff off. You're not going to be covered by prevailing wage. Truck driving is extremely interesting because we have a couple of court cases that we need to look to in establishing whether certain work on a job is truck driving or not. But that dedicated dump site versus not being one is probably a good example, again, to kind of wrap your head around who might be covered on a job and who might not be.
Okay, thanks. As an ACAP grant recipient, what are their responsibilities in regards to the Prevailing Wage Act? Again, it's the grant recipient's responsibility to contact labor and industry for a prevailing wage rate determination. If the project is prevailing wage, they have to bid it as a prevailing wage project, right? So that needs to be in their bid and the rates included in the contract. In most cases, the districts can assist those grant recipients and help navigate those requirements. Again, I know there's a lot out there that do that. Not everybody might be up to speed on doing that. If you want to talk about it some more as a district, give me a call. We can help walk you through that process. What if the Prevailing Wage Act applies to the ACAP project and I didn't know? Well, prevailing wage is still required to be paid. And you can do so without fees or consequences. In that case, you should notify the contractor, notify labor and industry, obtain the rates, provide a copy, get the contractor to provide a copy of the certified payroll, and verify that prevailing wage was followed. So it's not a, it's not like it's the end of the world and everybody's going to get a fine. It's, just go back and make sure you pay the rates. It's fairly simple. I know this comes up occasionally and it really isn't a big deal as long as everybody's willing to just make that payment. So it really doesn't take long to fix that.
Yeah, and I'll add in there quick. What happens a lot of times is there's times when we're all human beings, right? Imperfections happen. People forget or don't even know sometimes. So when there's times when a project might be near completion or done, and a lot of times DCD, for example, economic development, they'll come back to the grant recipient and say, hey, send us all the certified payrolls from the job. And that recipient says, I have no idea what that is. Well, the problem now is that we had a couple weeks of work that happened. No one got paid prevailing wage and no one ever registered the project. We have to go back after the fact. It creates more work. It does. Because our office then has to ensure that the contractors paid prevailing wage, and if they didn't, they have to up the rate of what they've given their workers. It does create more work that hopefully could be avoided by knowing all this prior to it and registering the project.
Okay, kind of a follow-up in that, like what happens if the farmer landowner doesn't pay prevailing wage when it's required? They are legally required to do that. In that case, it's a civil matter between the farmer and the contractor. Again, it can be rectified simply by paying those rates, right? And making sure the contractor pays those rates, and it all is taken care of. One thing to keep in mind, prevailing wage rates must be paid prior to making a final payment on an ACAP contract. So if you're a district out there, you guys have to verify and make sure that this actually happened. And I'll show you how to do that here in a slide or two, but it's not overly difficult to verify. But make sure that that happens before you make those final payments. So on the flip side, well, if the contractor doesn't want to pay prevailing wage, they are required to do that by law. If they don't do it when required by law and it becomes an issue, they can be debarred from working on publicly funded projects for up to 3 years. And then they get put on a debarment list, which you can find on Labor and Industry's website to know if they're not allowed to work on those projects. Brian, anything to add on that situation?
Yeah, we have a number of different recourses when someone violates the act. On one hand, it could be completely an adjustment of wages. It could be an unintentional mistake, and the contractor would pay workers back and sign something to say, I unintentionally did this. The real egregious cases are the ones that we consider for the intentional debarment. It's a lot of work for us as well. We have to go to a hearing. We have to prove that someone purposely circumvented the law, purposely ignored us, didn't want to pay workers. There are examples of these things that happen where we have times contractors admit, yes, I knew it was prevailing wage, but I didn't think my workers were worth it. I paid them less or this or that, right? They're the standout cases for us that we treat seriously. Try to keep an equal playing ground for all contractors. And the purpose of prevailing wage is when you have contractors who are accepting tax dollars to do their work, we need to make sure that there's a higher level of workmanship happening, right? We don't want people on a job site who purposely violate the act, still take taxpayer dollars and underbid other people and circumvent the idea of what prevailing wage is for. So I'll just add that in. We do take intentional violations seriously.
Excellent. Again, here's that website with the debarment debarment list. That's how you find it. It's right, there's a link there, but Google is your friend, can help you find that if you need to. We do have a prevailing wage notification letter for ACAP. Here's a copy of it. I think Eric sent these out to everybody or all the district managers with our list of forms. It's simply just a notification that lets the farmer applicant know these funds are subject to prevailing wage. If it's over 25,000, you have to make sure to pay those prevailing wage rates. And it's just a simple signature from the grantee or the applicant here, and then the district signs it as well. So everybody's aware and everybody knows they're signing, yep, we know it's prevailing wage. This form goes with every project, right? Whether it's prevailing wage or not. So if it's a $15,000 project, you still have to notify them because there could be an amendment down the road. There could be, you know, something happens that makes it go over that 25. So we want to make sure everybody's aware. And if it is actually a prevailing wage project, we ask that you get a copy of the certified payroll from the contractor. And I think I know there's a question, do you have to get one, or does the district have to get one copy, or the first and last? I think we only ask that you follow up and make sure there's one copy. And I believe the farmer has to get these weekly. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, so what would happen is a weekly certification of payroll should be done by each week by the contractor. That should be given to the farmer, whoever the grant recipient would be. And then I guess at the end, it sounds to me like your agency will be collecting these in some form in the future to prove prevailing wage was paid. But in theory, that should be on a week by week basis. I will make a note that the Prevailing Wage Act states that they should be notarized. What we can tell you to make things easier, we have decided many, many years back that only the very first week and the very last week need to be notarized. But everything's being looked at by the notary, right? That way you don't have to go week by week and get them notarized every time. The first payroll, the last payroll, that's perfectly fine, but they need to be given to the farmer weekly.
Yeah, thanks. So as far as the district is concerned, if you get one of those first or last notarized and keep that in your file, when we come out and do like a quality assurance visit after the fact, we're going to look for that in your file and make sure you have it. And that helps us, you know, peace of mind that you followed up and made sure prevailing wage was paid. So it's kind of like a check on the whole system here. This is the back of that form. And I believe down at the bottom is where the notarization goes. Just show you what that form looks like. Okay, this is the point where, Eric, do you want to introduce Kent and talk about the ACAP equip stuff?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Brian, for all the answers that you've given us. When we first got this together and thought about doing a prevailing wage webinar for you guys, we thought it might be a good idea to get a district on board that's been dealing with prevailing wage and some other grant programs such as CEG and stuff like that, and also maybe even getting EQIP into the mix of these projects and sort of give you some insight of how a project could come about and how to work through that. So I reached out to Lancaster County Conservation District. They were willing to put forth an effort and put a presentation together for us. And Kent Bidding is going to do that for us, I believe. So Ken, if you want to take it from there, we'd be happy to hear your presentation.
Sure. Good afternoon. I assume everyone can hear me. Is that correct?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
yes, we can
great.
Hear you.
So yeah, Eric and Justin asked us to put together a brief presentation on how EQIP, CEG, and Prevailing Wage has worked together on a project. We did have one project that included EQIP, but did not include Prevailing Wage. So I'm going to discuss how we will approach this circumstance for ACAP. The project that we had that included EQIP was a very small project that required a modification, stayed underneath the 25,000, and was quicker to apply for CEG, and in our case, than to go through the modification for EQIP. So Eric, are you going to advance the slides, or how do you want to do that?
If you want, it doesn't matter. If you want us to advance the slides, that's fine. Or if you want to start sharing on your end to make it easier for you, that's totally fine too. It's up to you.
Okay, I'll probably just have you advance the slides then. Thank you. Just the couple of discussion topics, and we really covered the first two already. Just kind of a rehash on for our end, determining and evaluating the cost estimate, applying for the prevailing wage determination, and then the EQIP and ACAP grant payments, and then payment requests for completed BMPs. So you can go ahead, Eric. So obviously the cost estimate has been discussed already, is the key to determine whether prevailing wage applies. The ACAP application, if you look at the application, it needs to include a cost estimate. You want to make sure that the cost estimate, if a consultant is doing that, has considered prevailing wage, if the estimate exceeds 25,000, and we have an engineering staff here in our office, so we also estimate costs for in-house projects, and we actually have a lack of actual BMP costs, construction costs to complete construction estimates. So we use the NRCS EQIP FAP costs as the basis for our estimate. On average, EQIP pays approximately 75% of the actual cost. So the way we actually adjust that cost is we add 25% to the incentive payment cost, and that does vary. There are some practices in our experience now that we have witnessed that is underrepresented, and especially for terraces, we add 50% to an incentive payment cost for terraces. So when if the cost in our cost estimate is close or exceeds 25,000, we add in Lancaster County we add 30% for prevailing wage, and we've actually found that actually works out pretty well. We've been in within 5 or 10% of our cost estimate, both plus or minus, on while using that 30% cost increase. Go ahead, Eric. Yes. So once we have our cost estimate, then of course we talked about going to and requesting the prevailing wage determination. I provide the link there as well. And like was stated before, you receive a email with a link to access your prevailing wages, and then we go ahead and print those out and attach them to the design documents so that the contractor has those. And we'll receive that email within 24 hours. Usually it's sooner, but definitely within 24 hours we get the prevailing wage determination. So Eric, you can go ahead and move forward again, please. So if we have a project that has prevailing wage, EQIP, ACAP, how do we go about deciding how the payment is made? We actually we'll only pay. We do not pay partial payments. We only pay when when BMPs are completed. That doesn't mean that the entire project has to be completed. It just has to be the specific BMP has to be completed. So we'll review the completed BMPs with the NRCS staff, and they'll determine what their EQIP incentive payment amount is. So we involve the NRCS staff, and they give us the number. So we receive contractors' invoices for ACAP. We'll subtract off what the NRCS incentive payment is, and then we'll that's ACAP share that we're responsible for paying. Each conservation district is able to set their cost share percentage. So all we do is multiply the remaining number times our cost share percentage and pay the contractor, or pay the farmer that amount. We pay the farmer because the contractor is with the farmer, the contract is with the farmer, and and then the farmer does pay the contractor. So you can move. So my last slide really is payment requests for completing BMPs. What we require for a complete submittal. We require the fully executed certification form that many of you probably have seen already in the documents that Eric has sent out. We require the contractor's invoices. We require the certified payroll forms from each contractor for the time worked. Forms obviously need to be signed and notarized, at least the first and the last. And then we always check the first payroll form that we get in and make sure that the rates and payment information are per what the payroll, the prevailing wage determination states. And then we do spot checks for the remainder of the certified payrolls. It's not a full and complete review. And then we retain those in our files in case there is a challenge. The farmer is supposed to also retain those files in their files as well. We know what happens with those. Sometimes they can't even find their plan. So we want to make sure that we have those on file as well. And then we always request construction photos and as-built drawings to finish out the request. So with that, I can answer any questions on how we approach it. Some districts may be a little bit different, but that we think that is the cleanest way to include EQIP and ACAP in the same for the same project.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Real quick before we get too far, I know Jared Shippey's on the line. Jared, do you have anything you want to add or confirm from NRCS side?
Sure. Good afternoon. Thanks, Justin. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so you'll have to forgive me.
That's okay. Thanks.
But no, certainly appreciate being here, and I will actually go ahead and agree. I mean, the way Kent explained it is pretty much the way that we've been doing it as far as partnering with conservation districts. Mostly CEG has been my experience, but I think the key to it is visiting those farmers and together and getting a plan together and communicating kind of how this all works from the beginning. But as far as, using NRCS INEs for the cost estimates, and I think that it's important, as Kent mentioned, that, each specific county should have an idea of what prevailing wage is going to add to a project. Now, Lancaster uses 30%. Some folks may be 50, some folks may be 20. And that goes together with the NRCS practice incentive payments as well. So typically what we do on the cost list is we've always said previously that 75% of what we think it would actually cost would be a typical incentive. For historically underserved, that will be our beginning farmers, socially disadvantaged. Traditionally, we look at 90%. Now, is that truly 75% and 90%, as Kent mentioned? That's a no, because we're paying a straight incentive payment. So he mentioned terraces, they figured out through experience in construction, the NRCS incentive payment is more like 50%. It may be more like 80% for another practice. We'll use fence, for instance. So depending on what area of the state you are, the NRCS incentive payment for specific practices may vary as far as what percentage of the actual installation is. But as far as, how we would partner together, like I said, I agree with Kent. So we would start with the NRCS INE. The conservation district, based off of that location, would be able to calculate what the NRCS cost estimate compared to what the actual real world would be, and also factor in the prevailing wage on top of that. And then once we were ready to sign a contract, NRCS would potentially do the inspection of the project. Somebody with our job approval authority would sign off, and the conservation district will be able to collect what they need for the prevailing wage. We would provide certification with the district as a partner agreement, and we would essentially make our payment per practice, like Kent mentioned they were doing at Lancaster. And The district typically would come in then with the difference, whatever percentage was determined by that specific conservation district, and yeah, work directly with the farmer, and they would be responsible for the contractor. So I don't know. That's a basic overview. I don't know if there's specific questions for me now or something I can take later.
Jess has a really good question about this.
Okay.
Jess, do you want to unmute? You can ask your question now.
Can you hear me?
I
Yep.
can.
Okay, thank you. I apologize if I missed this. I guess my question is more so for already contracted NRCS equipped contracts. And my concern there is if we are looking to provide supplemental funding through ACAP towards an Ag BMP project that's already funded through EQIP, likely that was not bid and contracted at prevailing wage. So how would we handle that? Because we would not know, we wouldn't have the prevailing wage rate determination. The project would have been bid at standard rates. So how would we be able to provide joint payment on a project where prevailing wage is not being paid? Does that make sense?
It does, and that's a good question. And I'll probably refer this to Brian on how prevailing wage would come into play there. But you know, NRCS would continue on our side with the contract that was initially obligated, and you know, obviously resume our roles in the design and certification of those practices. Our incentive payments that we had originally contracted would still be set. So Brian, in a contract that was currently active, that the conservation district maybe steps in year 2 of the contract, how would the prevailing wage rates, would they need to request prevailing wage rates, and would the practices already installed be subject to that? How would that work out? It's a very good question, Jessica.
That's a great question, actually. As I think this through, the answer number 1 would be if prevailing wage should have been applied for and was not for some reason or another, and we're a year or so into the contract, the answer is yes, rates would still have to be applied for. We internally would have to, we really cannot backdate the rate. So it would be whatever date somebody requests the rates, but the key thing would be, when did the work take place? So now the department has to do something to figure out what happened already and what work should have been prevailing wage that was not. If the rate today is $50 an hour, but the rate a year ago was 48, we would make sure that the contractor paid 48 an hour for the work that happened. You see what I mean? So we would have to issue rates now, but we would have to look to what the rates were at the time when the work happened. So does that hopefully answer the question? Yes, there would be prevailing wages, and we would have to go back and audit to see what they would have been at that time.
Does NRCS equip projects, is that subject to prevailing wage? Do they pay those rates? Because I understand they don't have to go through the whole bidding process. They can just hire whatever contractor they want, as far as I understand.
That's correct. NRCS is not. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I was gonna, I'm sorry for jumping on. Yeah, just real quick. Prevailing wage, the law itself, it doesn't have anything in there at all concerning the bidding process. So whether rates are necessary or not, that's a separate question. The bidding thing, I'll let you take that, but prevailing wage doesn't care how the bidding works.
Sure. And so on NRCS's side, we do not have to, our federal farm bill programs are not subject to prevailing wage. So our incentive rates are established through a national team and tailored through the states here. And we are also not required to bid out projects. So we work directly with the customer, and they can pick and choose whomever contractor they decide, or they can do it themselves.
Right. Okay.
Right. So we are not, all we care about is that it's completed to Pennsylvania Tech Guide standards.
Right. Okay. So I think my question still stands then, because the answer was if prevailing wage rates were supposed to apply and they weren't paid, they have to backdate it. But that sounds like it's not the case. These EQIP funded projects aren't subject to prevailing wage through federal funding. So how would that work if the project, $100,000 project was not paid out at prevailing wage rates, yet we are contributing ACAP funding, which is subject to prevailing wage? yet the contract doesn't include prevailing wage rates.
Right. So I think we're looking at, there were specific practices that were completed in year one. NRCS paid our incentive payment to the customer. The conservation district comes in year two, and there are 4 practices remaining in the contract that the conservation district is now contracting to piggyback essentially with EQIP on. Brian, I'll refer to you, but I'm assuming that your contract would be on the remaining 4 practices, and if they were over 25,000, then those will be subject to those prevailing wage rates. Brian, and this is a question for you, the practices that were already installed in EQIP in year one, that the conservation district is not essentially contracting, those would be still standalone, correct?
Yeah, that should be standalone. I would agree. And I think the overall big question always would be, if there's federal money in a project and there's state money in a project, if there's federal money and the money you're getting triggers Davis-Bacon, which is a federal prevailing wage, then it's a federal project, even if there's state money. If there's more than $2,000 in federal funds and the allocation of federal funds explicitly triggers Davis-Bacon, then it's federal. It's when it's absent language triggering Davis-Bacon, now there's no Davis-Bacon requirement with this federal fund. Fine, but there's still state money being put in there. So now there's coverage under prevailing wage on a state level where there may not have been under federal coverage. Is that, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think I heard the difference between state and federal, I think. So if it's not a federal job because the funding source doesn't trigger Davis-Bacon, but there's still state money in there, most likely now it's going to be a state prevailing wage project unless it's maintenance or not something that's construction. And then if that's the case, we would have to ensure that the state rates are paid for that work that was done.
Correct. And I think that clears it up. Jess, does that clear it up for you?
I don't mean to monopolize the conversation. Can I elaborate the question a little further?
Sure.
If we are not funding year 2 of the project, my thought was, right now the incentive payments are not covering the farmer's cost. So what if we contribute ACAP money towards B&P is also being paid through this federal EQIP money, because EQIP doesn't cover sufficient amount of the cost. So we would actually be funding the same components of the project. How do we handle that?
Correct. So any components of the project that state money is involved, as long as the total project is over 25,000, would be subject to prevailing wage rates. Brian, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that.
Does that answer your question, Jessica?
Okay, so then it's already been bid and contracted. I don't know how we would handle that, because we would have to, this program requires competitive bidding. So what if the contractor is already identified? Basically, that means we can't fund an EQIP project if a contractor has already been identified and hired without us bidding it.
That would be a question for Justin, I think.
Yeah, Jess, we gotta figure that out with bidding and attorneys. So that's still, like, the bidding stuff is still being figured out as we speak.
Okay.
And that's something we'll have to talk about legal counsel with in that instance, because there's gotta be a way for us to do that. And I just don't know exactly what that is. So stay
Okay.
tuned.
I think that was the heart of my question. I'm sorry it took so long to get there.
No,
No,
great
you're good.
questions.
I'm sure you're not the only one with the same question. Real quick, before we dive into more questions, there's a slide here that there are addresses and contact information for the regional labor and industry offices. Feel free to reach out to them with questions, or, you know, you can go through Eric or I, we can get you an answer for any question you might have. We can reach out to Brian for you, or you can reach out to him specifically. So that's it. Let's see, I'll go back up on our question list here and just make sure we covered everything to this point. There's a question about Growing Green. If they have a project that is funded by Growing Greener, partial Growing Greener, partial NRCS, partially ACAP, and part is by the farmer landowner, totaling almost $1 million. And the farmer plans to do some of the work, including labor and machines. Do they pay themselves prevailing wage? I think we covered that earlier, Brian. No, the farmer doesn't pay himself prevailing wage. that right?
That'd be correct. Only contracted labor. That's correct.
Kate had a good question. In this scenario with the farmer completing part of the project, is there a set value for their time to consider for the overall project value? If they're not normally getting paid, likely wouldn't have an established rate. And Brian, I saw you answered this in the chat. You said that's a good question. You should talk separately about it to try and work through it with Kate.
Yeah, and I can real quick say there is no law or regulation that there needs to be a set value. So, it comes up a lot of times with a state, like for example, work that takes place in a state job, for example, like let's say you're in a state facility and state employees are doing some work and other work is being contracted out. You have to factor for the state employees' wages in there somewhere for the total cost of the job, even though it won't be at prevailing wage because the state employees will not receive prevailing wage. But for the farmer question, what's the set value? It's an interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer. That's why I thought I'll talk to that person directly on that one. It's a very good question, though.
Yep, thanks. Ian had a good question. If a project registers for prevailing wage, but the farmer ends up doing all the work, and therefore prevailing wage isn't required, would this throw up any red flags to labor and industry, or do they get any notification? And Brian said, like, if they investigated it, the farmer would have to show there was no contracted labor. It might be best practice to contact labor and industry, and they can take the determination off their website. So, pretty straightforward. Okay, we got a new question came in. How does a contractor determine what class his workers are? Example, class 1 versus class 3.
I'll take that question. And am I able to share my screen? If not, that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I can stop sharing here.
Okay.
You should be able to.
All right, very good. Tell me if you could see my screen. I hope.
Yep, it's up now.
Okay, cool. This is our labor and industry website, and this is under labor law compliance. And if we scroll down to prevailing wage, and then we on the next page scroll down to a little section where it says prevailing wage quick links, including notes. On this page are all of the notes for journeyman laborers, heavy highway laborers, building laborers, operators, right? So what you would have to do, now we name these 29 county, 7 county, 33 county. 33 county basically is the Susquehanna River, anything west of it. East of it's 29 county. And of course, the favorite 5 county, which is Philadelphia location. So let's just, for the sake of argument, pick the 29 county building highway construction laborers. It will list the counties that we're talking about right there. It will say what these laborers' tasks could be. Spelled out. Same thing would happen for the operators. Same thing would happen for down here. We have asbestos removal. We have painters, electric linemen, even truck drivers. So if you don't see an answer to the question of what those laborers' tasks should be, call us up, email us, and we'll help you. But we try to list out anything that we feel those laborers' tasks or operating engineers or whatever should be as defined. When you look at the wage determination, you're going to see labor 1, 2, 3, 4. It corresponds to the listing on this website. And I'll stop sharing.
Oh, thanks, Brian. That was good. Carl wanted to know if we can send out the presentation to the districts so they can share it with all their techs. Yes, absolutely. We'll email it out to you. And Eric recently got our website up and running. So we'll get that website address out to you and we'll make sure we put this recording on there as well. Any more questions out there? There we go. Hey, Tim, go ahead.
So when I do the prevailing wage, I do the determination, I get all the rates, I print them all out, put them out for the contractor. I print out all those definitions that he just showed for, usually it's building and heavy highway. So I print them all out for my county. And then I have a form that I made that I make the person bidding show me the different rates that they're going to use for the whole job so that I know they looked at the rates, they looked at the definitions, they figured it out. That's part of their bid. Then I also know what I'm going to receive on my weekly payroll because they just showed it to me as part of their bid. So then I can say, well, they did, it was labor class 3, and those things change. It depends on what task that person is doing. So you get them broken down. If they're doing it right, it should be broken down. Well, he was a cement finisher for 3 hours today, and he was a carpenter for 4 hours today, and should all be broken down. But that way they have all the definitions in their hand and the rates in their hand and all the forms. I print out all the forms for them. So there's no excuse for them to not follow it. That way, that way they know, everybody knows what should be done. So that's how I do it anyway.
Yep, thanks. Thanks, Tim. Next question, if a concrete pump truck is needed on a project to place concrete is hired by a contractor, would the pump truck operator be subject to prevailing wage? And Brian said, yep, most likely that would be in their operator notes, and that person would be paid prevailing wage. So, good question, and thanks, Brian, for the quick answer. Amanda, go ahead, you got your hand up.
I think this is probably a question for Justin, but I just was hoping, so we can expect clarification about projects that are already contracted, already kind of rolling with EQIP, but then, we want to use ACAP for a portion of that project. For example, if it's a many line item contract and we want to just use ACAP for fence, and a building's been built, a heavy use area, all that, are we going to get clarification on these projects that are already happening and have not been subject to bidding and prevailing wage and then now are going to be?
Yes.
Okay.
We're working on it. I think the big question there is bidding. As far as prevailing wage goes, you're gonna have to pay prevailing wage. So we'll have to figure out exactly what portions of that, I don't know exactly, just kind of thinking through my mind, you might just do a separate contract and have NRCS, I don't know, back it out if you're paying the whole thing. If you're paying portions, that's where it's gonna get tricky, and we'll have to figure it out. So stay tuned. It's on our list of things to figure out. We're working on it. So thanks. Okay, next question. If NRCS is doing a large project on a farm, but the district is only helping with one practice, such as a watering system, does prevailing wage only apply to the contracted labor associated with the watering system? That's a good question for Brian.
It is. Let me read that again real quick. If it's doing a large project, but the district is only helping with one practice. So I guess we would have to figure out what that quote logical demarcation would be, right? I would say on that specific project, you could probably, if this is a real life scenario right now, email me the information concerning the contract itself, what the scope of work being done would be, and what the grant itself is paying for, and we can issue a determination letter. If it's hypothetical in nature, I think the answer was still going to be a hypothetical answer, that it depends on the circumstances. If we have one contractor who's doing everything and one little portion is being paid for by grant dollars, it could subject an entire project to prevailing wage if there's no quote logical demarcation. So it's best to talk directly with you about that one.
Okay, the next question, I think I know this one, Brian, from past, but correct me if I'm wrong. So the question is, I've heard that there is a federal prevailing wage exemption for ag projects. So if we get EQIP money and the project is over 2,000 and they go the route of federal prevailing wage, is the project then exempt from PA prevailing wage? So don't confuse prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon. So federal prevailing wage is called Davis-Bacon, but I know what you mean. Just it gets confusing when you mix the two. But so in the past, we've heard like if Davis-Bacon rates are paid, PA prevailing wage will accept those instead of the PA prevailing wage payments. Is that still true? Brian, is that right?
Yeah, you got, and that would be right. You gotta look to the total cost. So remember, and you're right too. The real distinction here is that Davis-Bacon is $2,000 in fund, while prevailing wage is 25,000, right? So we have to look to that. Number one, what's the actual total cost of that job? But if there's state money in there and federal rates are not applicable because the act does not trigger Davis-Bacon, but we still have state money and it's more than 25,000 and it's construction work or reconstruction work, then yes, it's going to be covered by prevailing wage at the state level.
Next question, will there be an additional webinar to discuss bidding? Yes, as soon as we get that figured out, we will put a webinar together for bidding. Thank you, great question. Does the amount paid in fringe benefits still apply to the base amount? I'm not sure what that means. Maybe Brian, you can elaborate.
I know what that question means, and that's a whole another hour. But actually, so Joy, that's a great question. So when we're talking about the base amount and fringe benefit, here's what that means. When we give our rates out, we give out the rate and the fringe benefit that could be counted as a credit towards the total package. Easy answer is this. We say the rate should be 20 and we say the fringe should be upwards of 10. That means the total package for that specific work is 30 per hour. The contractor has a choice to make. Do they pay 30 per hour in the cash, all cash? That's fine. If they say, well, we pay healthcare, we pay 401k, we have life insurance. Now they have to come up with the monetary amount of how much they're paying in on behalf of that worker. And let's say it's $6, $7, whatever an hour. They can take that credit, which means instead of paying 30 an hour, now they only have to pay 23 an hour if they're taking $7 in credit. But they have to actually be paying in that money for the worker. The worker has to be getting that benefit. So yeah, Joy, if you want some details on that, call me. That gets into the nitty-gritty of how the contractor should be doing this. So we can have a good conversation about that.
Thanks, Brian. So another question, will at any time the threshold of 25,000 be raised? I think I saw this question come in earlier too. I might have skipped it, but 25,000 went significantly further in the 60s when Prevailing Act was started. I think the other question was related to, is there any way labor and industry can raise that 25,000 outside of legislation change, or is there any work, any way you can do that?
There is not. So that would have to be a legislative change, correct?
Okay. Good questions though. If I missed any, I'm sorry. I'm looking through the list now. I think we covered them all. If there's any more, let us know. Give you a second. Okay. And if you think of anything after the webinar's over, by all means, give me a call or send us an email and we'll get you an answer as fast as we can. So thanks everybody for joining in. Appreciate your time. Thanks to Kent and Brian and Jared for helping out. We couldn't do it without your help. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. And talk to everybody later. Thank you.